Well, I want to thank my friend from Oregon for your leadership and your advocacy and calling us together for this important discussion tonight. And I want to thank you also for bringing up our great conservation hero, Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican president who I can't help but think is rolling in his grave over the fact that cornerstones of his legacy, the protection of public lands, the protection of wildlife, are under constant assault by too many of our friends across the aisle, and for the last 2 weeks by some very wrong-headed individuals who are heavily armed at a wildlife refuge in southern Oregon. You know, many Americans who turned on their TVs last week, I think, were probably surprised to see that this heavily armed extremist group had taken over a national wildlife refuge, that they were threatening to kill anyone who stood in their way. They were led, of course, by Ammon Bundy, the son of the infamous Cliven Bundy, that great philosopher who romanticizes slavery, who refuses to pay legally required grazing fees, and who organized his own armed insurrection in Nevada a couple of years ago. And Americans were surprised to see that this group, which was part of a larger protest against federal authority, public land policy, environmental regulations, was so violent and so heavily armed and so extreme in their demands. I think so many Americans are just surprised to find that people would be so violently opposed to our federal government's role in protecting public land and wildlife that they would do this kind of thing. But as a member of the House Natural Resources Committee, I have to tell you I'm disgusted by these reckless and dangerous and criminal actions, but I'm not totally surprised. I'm not totally surprised because on any given week in the Natural Resources Committee, you can hear the intellectual underpinnings of these dangerous, violent actions. You hear the divisive, over-the-top, anti-government rhetoric that's spewed by too many of our colleagues across the aisle, members of Congress who may now be criticizing ever so gently the tactics of the armed criminals in southern Oregon, but out of the other side of their mouth, they justify their actions by arguing that their anger and frustration with the government is somehow justified and legitimate, that we should essentially sympathize with them rather than be outraged by their seditious, violent actions. Now, I am amazed and grateful for the fact that our federal land management and law enforcement authorities have been so patient and so passive and so deferential because of their determination to try to bring this to a peaceful resolution. I admire and I respect that. I know where they're coming from, but let's be clear about this. There has to be accountability for the occupiers. This armed group of thugs occupying a refuge in the state to my north can't be allowed to do this without consequences because many people, you mentioned our colleague Peter DeFazio, believe, correctly in my view, that this wouldn't have happened had there been some consequences to the Bundy Ranch standoff 2 years ago. And unfortunately, despite a very similar action, despite all of the same heavily armed threats and violence and the near avoidance of a tragedy that could have cost untold numbers of lives, there really were no consequences. My understanding is that Cliven Bundy still owes well over $1 million in ranching fees to the federal government, that he's still grazing his cattle without permission. And because there's been no consequences, his son and the current gang that is occupying the refuge obviously took the lesson that they could do it again. And they will do it again and again as long as we continue to give them a pass. So there has to be accountability. There has to be some type of consequences for people that do this, but there also should be accountability for politicians who tacitly fuel incidents like this with their inflammatory and hyperbolic rhetoric that always casts environmental protection as an assault on individual rights and that falsely describes our national public lands as some type of a threat to states and to private property owners. It's not right. The truth is, in California and across the West, our public lands are a cornerstone of lots of local and state economies, including those in my district. I have huge tracts of federal public lands in the 2nd Congressional District of California, from vast national parks and recreational areas to 3 different national forests to numerous national monuments and lots of BLM lands. And for many of my constituents, federal lands help them put dinner on the table. They help them pay their bills. 91% of Western voters surveyed responded that they believe public lands are an essential part of their state's economy. We need to remember this. So I want to protect public lands, and I want to work cooperatively with the federal agencies that manage them to iron out differences. Our federal government isn't perfect. You know, they make mistakes. Sometimes they're not the best neighbors. Sometimes they aren't always as responsive and respectful to the communities and individuals that live nearby. And part of our job as members of Congress who represent those communities is try to make sure that the government, for its part, is doing the right thing, is listening, is being a good neighbor. But I've seen it work time and time again. And the notion that the only way to resolve differences with federal land management agencies is to take up arms and threaten a violent insurrection is just absolute nonsense. So those are a few of my thoughts. I certainly could go on at length about some of the success stories I've seen in my district where communities have come together and actually collaborated with the federal government, not just as a neighbor, but as a partner to do things, including things that brought jobs to those communities. I've seen it in Trinity County with a process called the Trinity County Collaborative, where, believe it or not, environmentalists are working together with folks in the forest products industry and with federal agencies and with all sorts of other interests, and they've agreed to cut thousands of acres of trees as part of a comprehensive stewardship plan. It can work. It's very unique, but it can actually work. And it can work in other places. It almost worked in the Klamath, in another part of southern Oregon, where we saw this historic coming together of farmers and fishermen and tribes and government agencies. But the problem is that collaboration depended on an act of Congress to actually happen. And sadly, under current management, Congress is where collaboration goes to die. And so we were unable to do the right thing there. But it can be done. And I again want to thank the gentleman for his leadership in trying to interpose a little bit of sanity into this debate.
Well, I appreciate your joining me in this conversation, in your past activity, and what we need to do in the future. You're right. These are opportunities, if done correctly, and you've had some of these experiences in California, where there are huge economic opportunities. There are 47 million bird watchers in this country. They spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion a year. In the Klamath, in the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, almost 24,000 people made that long journey. And I guarantee you, they wouldn't have been sightseeing there but for the Wildlife Refuge. You referenced the Klamath, a lost opportunity if we're not on our toes. Removing those 4 dams that have obstructed the flow of spawning salmon, prohibiting us from meeting our obligation to Native Americans, would create hundreds and hundreds of family wage jobs for years in Northern California. It's just one more example of where Congress is missing in action, where Congress hasn't appropriately funded these agencies to be able to fully meet the opportunities. I have no small, it's hard for me to express my wonderment that some people will come to the floor and somehow try and celebrate the Hammond family, people who were convicted of arson and who have a record of having broken the law before. Public records show behaviors that are not people you want for your neighbors. These folks do not have clean hands, and yet we have out-of-state armed thugs taking over this facility to somehow talk about these convicted felons and undercut this process. I am hopeful that we can work together for people to focus on the opportunities, to have the administration step up, act responsibly, cut these people off and remove them, and to take action against other lawbreakers like we would in other areas of the country. I appreciate your joining me today to have a little bit of conversation here to try and round out the picture that is missing from the media. It's not probably going to get us on Fox News, but these are things that the American public needs to know, because there is a path forward. There has been a regional consensus that is developed. There is a vision to protect the wildlife refuge and its economic activities and its future, and it's one that we should support. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.